Good morning, Mark Lanier with your video thought for the day. So I was reading through Luke 18 yesterday, and something weird happens that's subtle. You may not pick up on it if you're just reading along. Jesus, of course, was famous and still is for telling important messages through parables, through stories. The human brain, we listen to stories well. We relate to them. We put ourselves into them. Stories bypass a lot of our defenses. Storytelling is a great way to really zing in on the human heart. And so Jesus told a lot of parables. He told a lot of stories, but almost every time the parable will be told, and if there seems to be some doubt about its meaning, the meaning will be told. And maybe the followers of Jesus will say to him, well, what were you talking about with that story? And Jesus will tell it. Well, Luke 18, something different happens. Luke tells us what the parable means before he tells us the parable. It's very rare, very, very rare. And Luke does that, I think, because Luke wants to make sure as we're going through the parable, we don't lose track of what it means. He wants the meaning front and center for us before we even get into the parable at all. So the parable was one of, I'm going to flip on Luke. I'm going to give you what the parable means after I give you the parable. The parable was one Jesus told about a woman who went before an unrighteous judge, and the unrighteous judge did not help the woman get justice. And the woman kept seeking justice from a judge that is not a just judge, an unrighteous judge, a judge that doesn't give justice. And finally, the judge gives her justice because, even though he's an unjust judge, he gives her justice because he's just tired of her. Says, maybe if I give her justice this time, she'll get out of my hair. So that's the story. Now, Luke says, and of course Jesus added, if the unrighteous judge is going to do that, give justice at the end of the day to the woman, can you imagine how much more a righteous judge is going to take care of people? Like God. God's a righteous judge. So the beginning, though, of the parable is what's key here, because it helps us not misunderstand that parable. It's very easy to misunderstand that parable, but Luke doesn't want us to. So Luke starts out, it's Luke 18 verse 1, and he begins by saying, and Jesus told them a parable to the effect that they ought always to pray and not lose heart. Jesus told them a parable to the effect that they ought always to pray and not lose heart. Now, if the translators, and I've just quoted out of the English Standard Version, the translators had to make a choice there on the word ought. It's the Greek word dei, D-E-I in English letters, delta, epsilon, iota are the Greek letters, dei. Now, dei translates fine into ought, but we got a problem with ought in the English language, because sometimes ought means something that's advisable. You ought to come in. It's getting hot outside. Or you ought to roll up your car windows. It might rain. Ought can mean something that's advisable. So Jesus could be saying something to the effect of, it's advisable that you pray and not lose heart. But that Greek word dei doesn't mean it's advisable in its primary sense. The primary sense of the word is that it's necessary. It's imperative. It is a requirement. So Jesus is not saying, and Luke is not telling us that Jesus was teaching that, hey, it's advisable you pray. No, it's critical that you pray and not lose heart. So many people think that prayer is something that is either ineffective or that doesn't need to be done because God's going to take care of things anyway, or things aren't that critical at this point in life, or whatever. But Jesus told them a parable to the effect that it is absolutely necessary that we pray. Now, that's not because God's unrighteous. It's not because God doesn't want to take care of us. It's not because of any of that. It's the way God has set this system up God has set up a world system where we need to be in prayer, to seek his help. And then the key part, don't lose heart. And that means he doesn't always answer our prayers yes. Sometimes it's no, sometimes it's maybe, sometimes it's not maybe, but not now. But our job is to pray and then to trust God, not to lose heart, because he's a righteous judge who's going to see that his will is done on earth, and that will includes what's best for his people. That's your video thought for the day.